Morning, everyone, and let's introduce our speaker, and I'll just put myself there as well. Right, so good morning, everyone, and as always, nice to see you, and I'm sorry that we still have to be seeing each other, but as I've said every week, what all of us have discovered in this horrible period is that we need to be connected. And while we have the building and it's lovely to connect within the building, it's also lovely to connect with people around the UK. I can see we've got people from quite a lot of people from outside London, and to bring in someone each week from Israel who can give us the perspective from there, which is something we did during the Zoom period of COVID, and have thought perhaps not to return to, and certainly not these circumstances. But again, thank goodness that we can. If there's anyone online that doesn't know me, you can see my name on the screen. I head up adult education at JW3, which is a huge, huge pleasure. So we will be open to questions in this half hour, but please put them in the chat, and then I will get them to Paul. Paul, welcome. Welcome to JW3, welcome to Zoom, and thank you to Jacqueline for introducing us and recommending you. It's not an easy task that we've given any of you on these Friday mornings, but what I ask is, what is uppermost in your mind this morning? Perhaps you can sketch out for us what you and those around you are feeling, and what your perspective on the conflict is now, 4 and a bit weeks in. So over to you.
Thank you, Judy, and hello to everybody. So I think one of the the importance of what you're doing here, and I think it is very important, is that you're allowing Jews in the UK to hear from Israel what's going on here, because honestly, I don't think it's possible to fully appreciate the extent of the transformation of this country and its society from October 6th to October 7th. It is a different country, and it's a different society than it was, in all kinds of ways, and I'll say a little bit about that. But you don't get it just from reading even the Israeli press, although I certainly recommend reading the Israeli press in English rather than just relying on the British press. But yeah, I think hearing from people who live here is very important. Now, there are many people in Israel who are far more directly affected than I am by what happened on October 7th, in the sense that they either tragically lost family members or have family members among the kidnapped 240 hostages, or they are in the army, or have they've been called up, or they have brothers or fathers or sons or husbands called up. I'm not in any of those situations, and in that respect, I'm really one of the lucky ones. That said, I am a good example of how this is affecting all of us. So I'll just the most obvious example is that, even though, as I said, I'm not directly affected, I nevertheless know many people who are, and I think that's the case for everyone. I doubt you'll find an Israeli who does not at least know someone who lost a close friend or family member. And when I say lost, they mean that they were killed, or that they're in Gaza. And that, I think, has led to an extraordinary level of both national, communal unity, sense of unity and solidarity, and also a feeling that it's a little bit like the whole country is a shiva house, right? So it's not a funeral, meaning people aren't in tears all the time, and people are able to get on with their lives in all kinds of ways. You know, you go to a shiva house and people are chatting or even laughing sometimes, but there's an overwhelming and overriding sense that something terrible and tragic has happened, and that everything else that's going on is somehow secondary to that, and will continue to be affected by that for as long as the Shiva period continues. And of course, this Shiva period is not just a week. So I'll just say give a couple of examples what I'm talking about. So there's I noticed, I live in Jerusalem, and we have a balcony. I live, if anyone knows Jerusalem, I live in the neighborhood of Amon HaNatziv, and we have a balcony that looks, you can sort of see quite far across Jerusalem. And I noticed actually a few days ago this sort of beam of light shooting up into the sky after dark, a little bit like if anyone has been in New York and has seen the memorial to 9/11. There's like the two beams of light to sort of represent the Twin Towers, right? So it's a little bit like that, but just one of them. And I had no idea what it was. And, you know, my life's busy. I have 3 small children. I didn't inquire particularly. And then I happened to be at Teddy Stadium in Jerusalem, where there's usually football play. There's not football at the moment. There's no the football season's been suspended. But I was there, and it turns out that there is an installation that has been put up, of an extraordinary installation of what I realized now is not just one beam of light, but actually 240 small beams of small lights, very powerful lights, pointing vertically up into the sky. And alongside each light is a picture of one of the 240 hostages. And I was there, and I was walking around. I was with my two of my small children. I have 6-year-old twins, and one of the challenges that we have, parents of young children right now, is how we talk about or don't talk about what has happened. And my twins thought this was like this amazing thing. They were like jump, and one of my daughter said, "This is so cool," very loudly. And I had to say to her, "Listen, keep it down. Like, this isn't, you know, you think it's cool, like you think it looks amazing, and it does look amazing, but actually it's about something really sad. So we're not going to jump around and shout excitedly here." But it's an extremely powerful monument, sort of temporary monument, and it's a good example actually of how the situation of the hostages in Gaza is absolutely central to the way Israelis are thinking. It's really on the occasion that I watch British news or read British news, the disconnect is quite startling, because British news is focusing on what's happening in Gaza, and I understand why. Even if I take exception sometimes to how it's reported. But when you're here, it's not that what's happening in Gaza is irrelevant. Both in terms of the fact that our soldiers are there and our soldiers are, you know, being killed. There's been 34 Israeli soldiers killed so far in the operation, and of course the fact that in the operation there are tragically and inevitably a lot of Palestinian civilian casualties. We're not, you know, immune to that or unmoved by that, but we are a traumatized society right now, and central to that, as I said, is the situation of the hostages, and the terrible reality that we, the country, the government, the army, is trying to simultaneously pursue 2 aims which are not easy to pursue in parallel. One is to defeat, disarm, remove Hamas from Gaza, and the other is to do everything we can to get back our citizens, and that is not a simple thing. That is not a simple thing. In previous times when there's been Israeli captives, hostages in Gaza, firstly, it's been 1 or 2 people, not 240. But also it hasn't been in parallel with the largest military operation that Israel has embarked on, probably since the second Lebanon war in 2006. So that's something that is on our minds all the time. Like in the UK and other places, there are posters up everywhere of, or more, I mean, more than in the UK and in the diaspora, of course, but I know that they do exist, of course, in the UK and the diaspora, posters up of the hostages. Unlike in the UK and other places, there aren't people tearing them down. But it's impossible to avoid thinking about it, really, because it's there around you all the time, and of course it's on the news every evening and discussed all the time. And there's also, of course, the fact that there are still rocket attacks on Israel. Jerusalem has been pretty lucky. We haven't had so many in Jerusalem. I'm thinking that now I've said that there's going to be one during this half-hour talk, but hopefully not. Yeah, we've been pretty lucky in Jerusalem, but the south of Israel and the north of Israel and the Tel Aviv area, the main population center of Israel, has had huge numbers of rockets, and I think that is something that you don't get a sense of just looking at the news from outside. I had an experience actually. I think about 10 days ago, I was at a friend's house, and he's also British expat, and he has this very expensive and elaborate system where he's hooked up to British TV. I think it's probably illegal actually, but so I'm not going to mention his name. But he's hooked up to British television, and he can watch all the British. I think he mainly has it for the football, but we were watching Sky News actually, which I don't normally see, apart maybe the odd clip, and we were just watching it, and they were talking pretty much non-stop about the operation in Gaza, mainly from the point of view of civilian casualties, Palestinian civilian casualties. And while this was going on, this was a live interview with the correspondent who was on the ground on the Gaza border. While this was going on, the app on my phone told me that there was an enormous rocket barrage on Tel Aviv and surrounding areas in central Israel. And this wasn't mentioned at all, not by the correspondent who's there in Israel, nor the scrolling news at the bottom, which sort of gives like updates of things. And I was thinking, if you weren't here, you just wouldn't know this was happening. And that's the reality. This is still happening. And also in unexpected places. Yesterday, there was a drone that fell on a school in Eilat, which we now think was actually sent all the way from Yemen. Iran's proxies in Yemen is also getting involved in the war, and is every so often sending things which have been intercepted by the Americans mainly. Actually, this one was not intercepted and landed on a school. No one was hurt. I think it was after everyone had left school. But these kinds of things are still going on. So it's very easy because so much of the focus, again, understandably, I suppose, is on Gaza, that people outside of Israel are not really hearing about what's going on for Israelis, both the sort of incredible emotional and psychological toll that has been taken on the society, and also the ongoing rocket fire. I mean, it's, if it wasn't for what was going on in Gaza, the headline news would be that Israel has been under the most sustained rocket fire since it left Gaza in 2005. And that's, there's been 9,500, I think, rockets fired on Israel since October 7th. Just by way of comparison, the last big, really intensive war we had conflict war that we had with Hamas back in 2014, which was the last time that there were really a sustained rocket fire over a long period, there were 4,500 rockets fired in the whole 50-day conflict, right? There's more than double that. and it's been half the time. So that's, that would be the big story were it not for the fact that there's a major military operation going on in Gaza, and of course the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. So that's the reality here in Israel. I want to say a little bit before we get to questions, just about a couple of things that I think are important to know about, that you'll read about maybe in the news, just to get I think some headlines, which you can also ask me about if you want more details, which is to say that there's the headlines here right now, a couple of things. One is that there's been an agreement, Israel has agreed to implement daily 4-hour pauses to allow ceasefire, like temporary 4-hour pauses in the operation, essentially to allow humanitarian aid to get in, and that was something negotiated with the Americans and with others. Also to allow Palestinians in northern Gaza to evacuate to the south, because that's what we've been asking them to do, because Israel has now effectively cordoned off, it's actually cut Gaza in half, and the northern half, or northern third of Gaza, is now under the control of the IDF. And we've asked the Gazans to migrate south. And we've been sending them messages and other things. We've actually also, I learned yesterday, that the IDF has opened a hotline for Gazans to call if they're being impeded from moving south by Hamas, which we know has been happening. So that's interesting. The other conversation that's been going on here now is it started happening, a conversation about the post-operation scenario of what that would mean, what will happen, what will Gaza look like, who will be ruling Gaza. And there's been a little bit of controversy around that, because there was a statement by Netanyahu about how there would be he talked about an indefinite Israeli security presence. The Americans have said they're very against that. Other Israeli officials have retracted a little bit from that, and talk more about some kind of transitional period where there'd be an Israeli presence. The big question is whether the Palestinian Authority, that of course is in charge of the Palestinian population in the West Bank, would be brought back, and how that would happen, and if it could happen, and if they were willing to do that. And there's a lot of disagreement inside the Israeli government about that, about either the viability or desirability of that. And the Palestinians themselves, the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, seems to be reluctant to do that unless there are certain guarantees. They're trying to sort of make it part of an American pressure to push a two-state solution, that kind of thing. So we don't know what it's going to look like, but for the first time it's being discussed. It wasn't being discussed at all, really, and that was one of the criticisms, actually, of the government, both by the Americans and by some Israelis. So that's now a little bit in the news. And I'll also just say, just in terms of the military operation in Gaza, that there's sort of good news and bad news. The good news is that that the IDF has made, I think, much speedier progress than they thought they would into Gaza, and has encountered less resistance than they thought they would. The bad news, or at least let's say challenging news, is that it's very clear that the tunnel network, the Hamas tunnel network, is significantly more sophisticated and far-reaching than we had anticipated, and that it's an incredibly elaborate and sophisticated network of tunnels that they built underneath Gaza. We're not just talking, I think sometimes we think of tunnels, we think of, someone sort of scrabbling around, scrabbling through like a just wide enough tunnel to crawl on your belly. We're not talking about that. We're talking about tunnels in which vehicles can drive through, right? Tunnels that are housing Hamas armaments, tunnels that are big enough to have areas that Hamas can train in. That it's like an underground, they built like an underground town almost, connected through with smaller tunnels underneath Gaza, and they've been doing that for many years now, and we underestimated It's part one of the things that's going to happen after the war, of course, is an inquiry into how is mistakes that were made and how October 7th was allowed to happen. But broader than that is the question of how we missed what's been going on in Gaza, and I think also some bad decisions made by Israeli leaders over the years with regard to Hamas. But that's another issue which we can get into if you want. But that's that these things are obviously for the post-war scenario. Right now, I would say 8. I'm picking a number out of the air, really, but I would say a good 80% of the country, regardless of their views of the government, and obviously many people have negative views of the government, 80% of the country are pretty unified that we need to be focused right now on the here and now and on the war effort. I saw an incredible survey today which showed that 94% of Israeli Jews and 70% of Israeli Arabs feel connected to the state of Israel right now, which is very encouraging, particularly the Arab number, because of course the big concern, certainly of some, was that the Israeli Arab population would sort of defect, if you like, to if not to Hamas, then at least to a sort of connection with the Palestinians in Gaza and less with the state. And that doesn't appear to be happening, which is quite extraordinary, and I think very encouraging. I'm going to stop here and see if there's any questions, or I can go on if there are not.
Thank you so much. So we do have questions. Firstly, just whether you'd been called up to the IDF. Have you been serving?
Yeah, so I haven't been called up. I made Aliyah at the age of 29 and was too old to do army service. So I've not been called up.
I'm sure we're helping in other ways. In the ceasefire, we've been told that there's a 4-hour pause each day.
Yeah.
Is that just that they're not being bombarded, or do people on the ground also stop? Is it a general?
That's gonna. Yeah, I mean, certainly for us pausing in aerial bombardment. I don't know if that. I imagine, I mean, there are certain practicalities here. If there are soldiers engaged in a fight, in a gunfight or a firefight with Hamas, they're not going to stop during that for a period. And also, if they uncover a tunnel network, they're also not going to stop. But I think the idea is that ordinary Gazans will feel a pause. They will feel a quiet and a sense of security and safety for that period, for them to be able to move.
It's a good question. I mean, I have to say, I hadn't thought about it. You just told there's a 4-hour pause, but you don't actually think how it's going to be implemented.
Right. So yeah. So I mean, it's certainly a pause in any aerial bombardment, any missile strikes, and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Thank you. I was interested in what you were saying, but I hadn't realised that it was the Teddy Stadium. I heard about the lights. I think this is something we've all been. It's just been so amazing. We had the empty Shabbat table at JW3 2 weeks ago, and it was so moving. I think if you haven't actually seen these take place, it's hard to really imagine how emotive they are, and how I was like, really, do we need all this? We know about it, but of course that we know, but to bring it to everybody else's attention and keep it in everyone's mind.
Right. I should also say it's happening also on a smaller level in lots of places. So, for example, at my children's school, there are families like mine where there's no one serving in the army are adopting a family where the father has been called up, and we are helping provide food and giving rides to the children to school and that kind of thing. There's also at my synagogue, we were given there was a list of the 240 hostages, and everyone people chose and was allocated a name, and that person, we're saying Tehillim, Psalms for them, and on our Shabbat table this evening, we're laying a place for them at our table.
Yes,
And
we also gave out Shabbat candles with the names on that.
right,
That was from the Shabbat table people.
right,
I mean, I think all these things help us feel the connection as well.
exactly.
Not this. It's difficult to feel it, but I think as a worldwide
Yeah.
connection again, it does feel really important. And something else yes, the drone on the school overlap. I have to say, even though I'm on getting the news flashes from Jerusalem Post, I have not heard about that. Is there now moves to move the schools like they've done in, I know they've done it in Jerusalem and other places, into safer buildings, you know, where
It's a good, so I don't know. It's a good question. I think it becomes a regular thing because Eilat was relatively safe because it's so far away. But yeah, I mean, if it becomes a regular thing, I imagine, I think the threat from Yemen is relatively limited in the sense this is not a particularly well I mean, they're dealing with their own war inside Yemen. I don't think the Iranian backed Houthi regime in Yemen is going to prioritize shooting at Israel. But yeah, clearly, if it's something that continues, then they'll have to think about those kinds of things. Yeah.
So other than donating money, do you have any suggestions for practical things that you've heard that people can do from the UK? Any other ways in which we can volunteer? I do know that money is, we've all been continually told that money is the important thing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess money and there's certain organizations which have been extremely active in Israeli organizations which are extremely active in organizing the volunteer stuff. Many of them, by the way, probably the most active and the most effective have been the ones who are the organizers of the protest, the pre October 7th judicial reform protests, where because they were well funded and well resourced and had a huge database of people, they could on a dime sort of turn their agenda from that to this, and they became some of the main organizations, both organizing money and resources for people that had to leave and other things. So money is the main thing. I also think, this is kind of I guess a cliche in a way, but I think it's always encouraging for Israelis to hear about and see that Jewish communities are standing up for us and standing up against some of. I think for Israelis it's extremely disconcerting to see the things that are going on in the UK and the United States and other places.
Yeah, we're not too happy about it either.
No, I can imagine. No, that I understand. And look, as a Brit, I'm British. I have even more of a connection with it than the average Israeli, obviously. But yeah, I mean so any time that Jewish leaders, the rabbis and senior Jewish figures and community leaders speak out against that kind of stuff, we see, like, it's good for us to see that Jewish communities are sort of standing up for Israel in that way, because of course the opposite, when we see the minority, I know, but the small numbers of Jews who side with the anti-Israel lobby, so to speak, then that's something that is very, very upsetting for Israelis.
Yeah,
I think
we're having to contend that with as well.
Of course.
9:30, but I have had a couple of questions, so I'm just going to put it to you.
Sure, please. Yeah.
You can do in a minute. From Sarish particularly, is we were talking about the pause in the fighting in those 4 hours, and of course the worry is that Hamas will use that time to escape or to use it to rearm themselves, and of course we're all aware of that, but I think that I think the humanitarian bit has to be looked at, especially when Israel's being put under such pressure from the world. But is that how you would see it as well?
Yeah, and it's a really difficult balancing act, because I know that I think the reason why it's taken a while for this to be agreed is that Israel initially didn't want 4 hours. They wanted less, for exactly the reasons that your questioner said, that Hamas could take advantage of it. They wanted like a couple of hours, 1 or 2 hours, and then the Americans and others were pushing for longer. And I think 4 hours is probably the compromise that was reached at. And it's an incredibly difficult situation, because ideally, Israel would want to be, going, being as fast as possible, as consistent and persistent as possible with this. But obviously, the humanitarian issue is there, and both in terms of what you said, the international pressure, our own sort of moral calling, and other things. This is something we have to contend with. The frustration, I think, for Israelis is when they hear or seem to hear that, when you listen to foreign media or commentators, it's almost as though the main issue is the humanitarian issue, and there's also this war going on, right? Rather than the fact that the war is for us. For us, the main thing is the war and getting rid of Hamas and being able to live our lives in a normal way and be able to have people live in the south of Israel without fearing for a repeat of October 7th. So yeah, it's a very difficult balancing act.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. What's your name? Stephen, for your question. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I can take these questions forward into next week as well, where we'll be joined by another expat, David Newman, who many of you will have heard at JW3. And then the following week, we have we're moving to South Africa through Israel, and we have Avram Infeld joining us. So please do pass news around about this. This is free and open. I'm welcome everybody. This is one of the few times I can say, please do pass on the Zoom link. I have now made it a Zoom link for the series, so it will stay the same each week. So if you can find it, you can do that. But also, it's really helpful if you sign up on our website, then you'll get the official email from JW3. We do have, I realize now I should have put this in the beginning, for those of you who are not comfortable with chat on the Zoom, we do have an email address, and I'll make sure I put that in the chat next week, or send it round with the email from JW3. Paul, thank you so much for adding to our library of Friday mornings. I can't tell you how much they are appreciated. I'll put you on gallery so you can see people applauding. So
thank you very much.
Just to say to everybody, I wish you a safe and peaceful Shabbat, and we look forward to seeing everybody next week, and also, of course, at our ongoing events at JW3. So thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Bye.